And we're on lesson 4 tonight. Puzzling sayings of Jesus. There's several scriptures that we've, this is the last lesson on this difficult scriptures or scriptures difficult to understand before we go into the Easter lesson. Will be next week. So I guess it's still titled that. Lesson 6 goes into a different one. No, it's still that. Okay, well, sorry about that. It is still the same group. Tonight, we're going to look at several scriptures in the New Testament. And the first one is Luke 16, 1 through 9 is the scriptures. I'll read the whole thing real quickly, and then we'll talk about it just a little bit. It's Jesus talking. He also said to his disciples, there was a certain rich man who had a steward. An accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your stewardship, for you can no longer be a steward. Be steward. Then the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. Cannot dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I have resolved to do that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of his master's debtors to him and said to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. And to another, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and write 80. So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. Now that story is kind of, seems like it's out of place a little bit as far as it is a parable because they don't mention anybody's names or anything, but it's telling of a steward, and a steward is kind of like a head of a group. I mean, a head of a ranch or something. He's taking care of the masters or his owners, mainly probably his finances and his business, what he has. And he doesn't even really know how much people owe him. Okay. But we don't know exactly how he came about of wasting his goods. Now, it could be that he was telling people, okay, this will be 100, and he'd only give his master 80, so he was taken off the top of it, or some way he was embezzling from his master, and he was getting rich on it. So the master found out and told him he's no longer going to be able to be a steward, because if you can't trust somebody like that, somebody with money taking care of it, then you can't have them around anymore. And it talks about there, he kind of puts to us, what shall I do? For my master's taking my stewardship away. I cannot dig. So we don't know if he's physically unable to dig or if he's just lazy and didn't want to dig. Most likely. But it could have been the other two. And then it says he's ashamed to beg. So again, that was part of being poor in that area of Jesus's time. There were a lot of beggars because they couldn't make any money any other way, and they would get some little bit begging on the side of the road. We saw that in Paul's day and some of the others, when they saw it in Jesus' days too, that they were on the side of the road, and Jesus would touch them, heal them, of whatever it was, their limbs, and then they wouldn't have to beg anymore. They could go and do work. But in this particular case, he figured out a plan. He said, look, these guys, I know what these guys owe. And well, he didn't even know. He said he called everyone's debtors and asked them, how much do you owe? And one of them said he owed 100 measures of oil. So he said, okay, write it down quickly and write 50. So if you owed somebody, $100, and they said, okay, you can pay me back, just pay 50. You'd feel pretty good about it. You've made a deal, okay. So he's making friends is what he's doing. So he took all these different debtors that they had, and he gave them, one, a good feeling, and two, kind of ingrained himself with them. And if he even didn't get a job with them, he could at least go around and probably spend some time with them, spend a few nights. He wouldn't, he'd have a place to stay. They'd kind of be indebted to him, like I said. So the master, he understood what had happened, and he commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. Now, he didn't commend him for taking, embezzling, but he understood what he had done. And Jesus is not commending this action. He's just pointing out that the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. Now, what does that mean? Sometimes I guess, there have been several times in my life that I got caught up in some things, and I didn't really realize what was happening until after the fact. And I said, well, they're just using you, is all they were doing. And that's what happens sometimes. They knew how people would react, so they did something. And because of that, it wasn't anything that would have helped all along. It was one of those things that, well, they were just using that to get their way. That's what they were doing. And that's kind of what he's saying. You got to be smart, and because ultimately what the last part of this says, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into an everlasting home. He's making a place for him to go. What a lot of the commentators think this was doing was, we're here on earth and we're not really working for, we're working, but we're working for a heavenly home, not so much a earthly home. And sometimes we may not, we will, the old church or the church would ignore stuff and not look into stuff and not take it seriously, I guess. And I guess for one example, it may be not get involved in politics, that they say, well, that's earthly. We don't want to do part of that. Well, if we don't do it, who's going to do it? There are some people that have gotten involved with it and, you know, put their opinion to it. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything, but you do have to get involved to show people, just like the church today. We're almost being handcuffed in the things because everybody else is seeing what just a few people can do to handcuff other people. I mean, handcuff huge amounts of people. I mean, by shutting down the churches, it's just ludicrous that you could, during the pandemic, you could go to Home Depot and have a group of up to 500 people in the Home Depot. It was okay. But church, you couldn't have over, I can't remember what it was, 20 people, 10 people, whatever it was.
10 there for a while.
Yeah, 10. So that's just, why was there such a, and now some of the cases have come back because there are still a lot of churches, especially in California and around the areas, they're still not meeting. So they're just, I mean, the government said they can't meet. Well, they're meeting anyway. What's the big pastor's name? John, got his book up here.
MacArthur.
Yeah, MacArthur. His church, Grace, I think, Grace Fellowship, I think it is, or something like that. They were getting charged $10,000 a day if they met. And he said, we're going to meet, we're going to go. You can take us to court. And I think that has come about that they said, no, you cannot let people go to these places and, let the bars be open, let all these different things be open and not let the churches be open. And that's what it's saying. We need to make sure that and we know on this earth that it's just for now, it's just here, but still yet we need to be represented, in this work. Here, he's just saying we need to keep our eyes open. We need to make use of whatever we can. We are given, it's very similar to the talents parable, where one person's given 1 talent, one person's given 5, and another person's given 10. Each one of them have a different talent, and some of them were exquisite. I mean, they, doubled their money. And then the one, he didn't do like he buried his in the sand. He thought it'd be better to give it back. Well, that's essentially the same thing here. This guy was doing something, and at least he figured out how to take care of himself. And that's what the guy was commending. The master there was commending him for acting shrewdly, so he would have a job later on. And there are other implications of that. It keeps on going. Verse 10 says, "He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches?" And that's where Jesus is trying to get. If we can't earn our trust by that way, then who's going to trust us with the true riches? And what we're talking about here is in heaven, our heavenly. So that's kind of the part of the implications from that verse and that chapter.
You was mentioning there about, not getting involved, but Jesus told the disciples, the coin, he said, "Render therefore unto Caesar those things that are Caesar's, and unto God those things that are God." God has established governments, and like you said, the Christians have just almost backed out of politics and not, again, in government stuff, and that's one of the reasons we're in the condition we're in today.
Mm-hmm. That's right. We got to be able to stand up for ourselves, I guess, not be pushed over. That, we will abide by what the government says up to a point. If it starts saying something like it goes against what's in the Bible, then no, we can't go with what the government says. So the next one is called turning the other cheek. And we've heard the scripture, verse 38. It's in Matthew chapter 5, and I'm going to read 38 and 39. It says, "You have heard it said, it was said, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also." And that kind of goes against, like, well, if they slap me up, I'm going to, punch them back. And it's not really what it's talking about. I found it kind of interesting, and I don't remember if it was in our lesson here or is in. It's talking not about violence, it's talking about when people are trying to revile you, trying to persecute you, because it talks about on the right cheek. If you get slapped backhanded, and if you're somebody's in front of you, you're going to hit their right cheek. Okay. If you're standing with your right hand, you're going to hit him. He's turned around, so it'll be his right face. That's an insult. Okay. And yeah, you can hit hard like that. But if you go that way, that's going to hurt. I mean, it's going to hurt a lot more. You're going to come this way. That's violence. That's doing things that are violent. And that's what they said it's trying to explain here, that people are going to revile us. They're going to um, try to take advantage of us. And we just need to not get involved with that. Now, if they're assaulting us, yeah, we can defend ourselves. We can, as we was talking last few weeks, we can, self-defense. We can get away from them. But the next part of that scripture says, if anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him also have your cloak also. This is the physical world. And so many times you could take that, somebody could take that and say, okay, well, I'll let them come in my house and take whatever they want. No, that's not what it's saying. If you have more what you need and somebody else needs it, you need to provide for them. The church, that was one of the church's responsibilities, was to provide for the widows and the orphans. It also implies that everybody will be doing the same thing. Nobody's going to be taking advantage of it, you see. But the widows and the orphans, they need help. So we need to help them. If we see somebody and we don't do that, then we're not following after Christ here. It says Christians are blessed when they suffer for believing and doing what is right in God's sight. They are not blessed because they are assaulted, criminal intent, or violence or robbery. It is clear Jesus meant his followers should patiently endure personal insult and injury for righteousness' sake, even as he did. But this rule doesn't prevent one from trying to protect yourself or others from the assaults of mean and violent people when righteousness is not the issue. Second, one needs to consider the rule about turning the other cheek in the light of the practice of this rule by Jesus and the Apostle Paul. For righteousness' sake, both Jesus and Paul patiently endured personal and insult injury, but they did not turn the other cheek when the issue was correct administration of justice. Okay, the next, we go to John 18. It talks about a slap on the cheek. Let me get there real quick. This was when he was being investigated after he was arrested. Verse starts at verse 19. The high priest asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always meet. And in secret, I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard me what I said. Indeed, they know what I said. And when he said these things, one of the officers stood by, struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? This particular case, it says he struck him with the palm of his hand. So he was trying to hurt him. He was, trying more than insulting him. He was trying to, tell him. But he said, do you answer the high priest like that? And then Jesus answered, if I've spoken evil, bear witness of me, of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? And he couldn't answer him that. Ananias sent him to Caiaphas at that time. So he saw that he was in the wrong way, that the Roman priest or the Roman soldier, the officer who struck him shouldn't have done that. There are several things Said when an officer of the court did not like his answer, he slapped him. Jesus didn't turn. Then Paul does the same thing. It talks about that, first of all, Jesus was pointing out, you're convening a conference here or a jury, and nobody's, I have the right to be heard. It's some of the things he's going through the litany of the legal precedents of what they were doing here. He was telling him, you've heard what I've taught. You've heard people out there. If people have heard something that you think I've done wrong, you need to ask them. He said, I haven't seen anything. At that particular time, there were different sects that operated in that area, and they were trying to disrupt the Roman government. So that's what they were trying here, to implicate Jesus in that respect, that he was trying to get him on something that really he didn't do. So he asked him again, legally, what right do you have to strike me? You don't. That's what he was trying to ask him, trying to get from him. And then the last part's in Acts 23. Paul is under 23. This is where Paul's imprisoned, and he goes to the council and said, then Paul, looking earnestly at the council, said, men and brethren, I've lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall, for you sit to judge me according to the law, and you do command me to be struck contrary to the law. And those who stood by said, do you revile God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was a high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So Paul was in his right to ask them why they'd struck him. Now, they took it upon themselves. He got pretty aggravated at them because he's calling them the whitewashed wall. You're doing things one way and it's not coming out to be. And he said, you're doing this and you're contrary to the law. You've got to understand, as Paul was being a Pharisee, he was basically, in our terms, he's a lawyer. He knew the law inside and out. So in this particular time, he had been in prison, so he probably did not know that this person in front of him was the high priest. But he said that. He told him, he backed off. He said, okay, the Bible says you should not speak evil of a ruler of your people. And since the high priest is one of the rulers, even though he was an evil ruler, or certainly wasn't following after the law the way it should be. Okay. And then the last few scriptures is Matthew 29 or Matthew 24. And this is the coming of the Lord. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun shall be darkened. Is this right?
Matthew 29, Matthew 24, 29 through 35.
Yeah. Yeah, these signs will appear. And the Son of Man, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens and the earth will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man shall appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven in power with great glory. And he will send his angels with great sounds of a trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds of the heavens. And it jumps on down to verse 32, then says, now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branches have already become tender and put forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see these things, know that it is near at the doors. Assuredly, I say unto you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. And 35 is heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not by no means pass away. What a lot of people get hung up on is the this generation will by no means pass away. We don't really know what he didn't mean the people that was living on earth then. He's meaning this time in his life. It changed from the law, okay, from Abraham until Jesus, it was the law, and from then till now, it's grace, and that's the generation, the grace generation, that is not going to, that it's not going to pass away until he comes again. Goes through the coming of the Lord and talking about the tribulation and how he's going to come at the end of time. And he tells us then we need to learn when the branches have become tender and put forth its leaves, a fig tree, you know the summer's near. Just like right now. We know the trees are coming out, the leaves are starting to pop up. We see that. We know summer's coming. It's going to freeze tonight, but summer's coming. It's going to be 80, what was it, 2 or 3 next Sunday or Saturday, something. So we know that's coming, but we need to understand that because of this, it's not happening right away. We see these things happening. Even in his days, it seemed like those was going to take place immediately. It's just winding down. This particular time is winding down more so than it ever has before. It says in that word group, generation can mean a class or a group of people. Other Christians have concluded that Jesus was talking about the unbelieving generation, whom Jesus described as vipers, adulterous, wicked, faithless, and perverse. By this reckoning, Jesus meant the unbelieving generation would not pass away until he comes again. We see that now. Okay. I mean, there's a lot of unbelieving in our generation. Another interpretation dating back to 1800s is all the end time events leading up to the second coming of Christ will occur within one generation, usually interpreted to mean 40 years. Well, that's where we've got a bunch of the time setting. Okay. Israel was formed, and then 40 years later, we had the 1988. Christ will be here in 88. And he wasn't. And then we hear 40 years of being established as a nation. And, that went and passed by too. We don't really know exactly when he talks about the generation, it's more generic than a time of years. It's like it said in the first one, I believe more so. It's a group of people that they have the same mindset. And just like this unbelieving nation or unbelieving people, that's not going to pass away. It's kind of like when Jesus said, you'll always have the poor with you. I can do all I want to about the poor, but you're always going to have poor people. It's just part of the system. Some people will be not poor and some people will be poor. So, comments? Questions?
You mentioned a while ago about, widows and orphans, and really it's the true widows and orphans.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And now I was thinking about, this dispensation of grace. When grace passes away, the Lord's going to come back.
That's right.
and he's of course, and as the fig trees here, so we know. But like you said, you can't get started. I mean, dates and times, because if you do that, you're going. Nobody knows the day or the hour that he's coming back.
Now we can, as Philip has taught, we can know the season. I mean, he tells us several things, and he tells us the season. We just don't know which. I mean, if it's the season for this year or next year or 5 years from now, we just don't know that. So, but it seems like more and more, I don't see how it can go much further.
Not here.
It just seems like it's getting worse and worse. The things you hear on television and the news and all that seems to want to drive you crazy.
There's not too many prophecies that hadn't been fulfilled.
I think there's very few. Very few. Get my buddy out of the way here. All right. Well, I guess we'll see you Sunday morning.
That was good.
Yes. Y'all have a happy Thanksgiving. I mean, Easter, rest of Easter week.
You
One of them
sound like
holidays.
us. I had it